Okay.
Stand side of the blood vessel.
All right. Let's make a list. I don't know which color is going to be easier to see.
Looks like a wall.
Alligator, blood vessel. I know y'all can read my handwriting. A wall. Anything else? Anybody else?
Roll.
I'm sorry?
A roll.
A roll?
A roll. Honeycomb.
That's a good one.
Snake skin.
Snake skin. We'll put that up here next to alligator. Y'all saying y'all can't read my handwriting? Y'all saying the color's bad? I can make it in white. That's not it. That's a little bit easier. That's a little bit easier. But now I got to go back through and redo all these. Reptile. Now it's just the handwriting.
Somebody said a roll.
Yeah, we're doing reptile, alligator, and snake together. Somebody said a honeycomb, which I think is an interesting option. Somebody said a blood vessel, which that also is an interesting option. And that should be an E and only one L, but that's okay.
You got it.
Anything else?
I said roll.
Yeah.
All right. You did.
Or bridge. Something.
Bridge. All right, I'm not going to tell you what it is. I am going to instead advance to the next slide. What is that?
That's a leaf.
That is a leaf. It's amazing how quickly. Just so you know, that's a leaf too. That's a leaf. What's that?
Leaves.
And this? All right. What about that? A forest or the wood? What about that? Kind of.
Lightning.
It's the same thing as the picture before it, just pulled back a little bit further. And then that. Now, again, I want you to understand, going all the way back to here, we're looking at the same thing. We're looking at exactly the same thing, just from different perspectives. This is an important lesson for what we are about to endeavor to discuss in our Bibles. This is how most people analyze the book of Revelation. They look at every little bitty letter. They look at every little number. They dissect it. They tear it apart. They talk about it one word at a time. Does anyone communicate that way? D, O, I, T, A, L, K. Obviously, this is going to take a while, so I'm going to stop. Do I talk that way? No. Would that be an effective way to try to speak? By the way, I want to go on record. I can't speak a word of that clicking language that those people speak. I have no idea whether that's effective or not. It may be the most efficient language in the world, but it seems completely inefficient to me. That is not, if I'm creating a language, how I would start. In fact, I would start the way most children do. As we were talking about before class, I would start by pointing at things. And then figuring out sounds to represent those things. My language would probably be annoying because it would probably be full of automatopoeias that whatever I said just sounded like the thing that we were looking at. Because that seems to be the most logical thing to do. But we have a language, and yet we get to certain places in our Bibles, and we want to talk about them in terms of pieces of the communication. will pull a word out and spend days focusing on what that word means without even taking into consideration the sentence that it's found in, or the paragraph that that sentence is found in, or the section in which that paragraph is found in, or the book in which that section is found in, or the totality of the Bible in which the book is found in. It's very important when we talk about interpreting Scripture that we understand that this is a continuous message from the same source. It's not, it was given through different men, and it was given at different times, and it was given in pieces, but it's one continuous message. Which means that to understand any one part of it, what do we need to do? Familiarize ourselves with the whole. And realize that things that are talked about in one place in a particular way are more than likely the same things under consideration in another place when they're being talked about that way. Not always. The context usually will bear that out. But that's why it's so important to look at the context and consider it. And yet, this is how most people study the book of Revelation, when that's the way it ought to be looked at. And so understand this is a big picture book. We need to read this book in its entirety. Anybody know how long it takes to read the book of Revelation? I have no idea, but every single source I approached said about an hour. So I'm going to go with that. 21 chapters. I don't know how many exact words are in it. The average reading speed of the average American is about 250 words a minute. And that's where they come up with these time frames for reading these things. Some people read a little slower. Some people read a little faster. So those are not hard. But those are averages. It takes about an hour. We spend more time than that watching TV every week. We can read through the book of Revelation. We can find the time to read through the book of Revelation. That's how it ought to be read. It ought not be read by reading a single statement and then going, oh man, what's that mean? Is that how you read a letter from your... Man, I gotta look at that. Is that how you read a letter from your sibling? By reading the first sentence and going, okay, now I gotta figure out what they're saying. Or what do you do? Read the whole letter. And by the time you get to the end of the letter, what do you generally have? A fairly good idea about what they're trying to say. Now, you might go back and read parts of it, especially if it's a technical thing, or there's some hard, complex information that's being communicated. You might have to go back and revisit parts of it to get the details. But you don't do that until after you've grasped the purpose of the whole thing. And the same way we ought to treat the book of Revelation, the study of the book of Revelation. So, homework piece number 1 before we get into the verse by verse of this book, which, by the way, I'm probably not going to do in a pure verse by verse style. I'm probably going to read it in blocks, and we're going to talk about it in blocks, because that's the best way to do it. The homework between now and when we get to that stage is to read the book. Preferably straight through, like you would read a novel or anything else. Look, it's exciting stuff. There's battles, and there's dragons, and there's lakes, and there's fire, and all kind of neat stuff. It's just like reading something else, except there's an important point from God that we need to take away from it. So it's better. It's better than reading Tolkien. It's better than reading your favorite fantasy, because there's a point behind it that actually teaches you something. And so you can do this. I'm convinced that we can all do this. After reading the whole thing. Now, these are suggestions. Obviously, I'm not going to collect your work and grade it, although that might be a good idea. After you read the whole thing, write your overall reflections down. Sit down with a notepad. After you've read the whole book, and just write down your general reflections about what you just read. What you think about it. What do you think it's trying to say? questions that arise. Because guess what those questions are? Those are the things you need to be looking for the answers to. If it raises the question, the answer is somewhere. You may find it next week, you may find it next month, you may find it next year, but the answer is somewhere. And so you make a record of the question, and you know now what you're searching for. How easy is it to find something when you don't know what you're looking for? If your spouse or your child or somebody says, hey, come look, come help me look. What's the first question you're going to ask them? What am I looking for? You can't possibly find something if you don't know what you're looking for. Same way about reading this book. Look, if we don't know what the questions are, we can't possibly find the answers. So read the book. Get a sense of the questions that come to mind, that it raises. Well, what is this? What does that mean? And then start looking for the answers, and the way you do that is by reading it again. And then after you do that, you meditate for a while about what you read. I'm not talking about crossing your legs and holding your third finger and saying Om with your eyes closed. I'm talking about thinking about what you have read. Thinking about your reflections on what you have read. Thinking about your questions about what you... Do you know what... We'll use police investigators as an example. Do you know how they solve cases? Some of them have a very formal process, by the way. They actually train this process. You get a big whiteboard, they put pictures up there, they string things together, they write ideas down. They have all this information collected. They are constantly thinking about all that stuff. It may be in the middle of the night somewhere when all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, there's a connection between that and that. And the next time they go to the board, there goes the string. And then they start thinking about what? What does that connection mean? All the while they're trying to answer the overarching question of what? Who did it? How did this happen? Whatever you want to phrase that question as. But they're thinking about it all the time. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about meditating on this. You have these questions floating around in your head. You have the things that you read floating around your head, which contain the answers to your questions. Our goal is to do what? Connect those two together. And so meditate about it for a while. A day, 2, a week. Let it all soak in. Dwell in your thoughts on it when you have a moment. When you can't sleep at night. You might have trouble sleeping at night. You got time built in for meditation right there. And if you do it long enough, guess what might happen? You may fall asleep on yourself. So there you go. If you start lecturing to yourself, you'll fall asleep just like you do when I'm preaching. Think about it. Use that time. Don't get caught up with the individual words. Don't get caught up with the individual phrases. Don't be afraid of something just because you don't know what it means right now. That's okay. Read it as a whole unit. Anybody know what the word revelation means? To reveal, to make known, to lay open, to make bare. People get all freaky about this book and talk about how hard it is to understand. The name of it is to make known. This is not written to be hard to understand. It's not trying to be difficult. It's actually trying to be easy. That's one of the reasons it is written with the high amount of symbolism that it's written in, because that's the way our brains work. We actually have a tendency to take things that we know about and understand and relate them to new concepts that we don't know about and don't understand. That's how we come to understand new things. That's just the way our brains work. And the one who made us knows that. So the Bible is full of symbolic language, of, what do we call that language? That flowery, nice language. Similes and parables and allegories and all those things. What is that? We have different names for it, but what we're doing is we're creating word pictures. Because it's a whole lot easier for us to understand ideas that may be abstract by seeing them in concrete ways. How do you talk about a God that is spirit and can't be seen with the human eyes to people that only relate to things that they can see? You use words like Father. Oh, I know what a father is. I know what a father does. I know what that role is all about. By the way, just for fun, I'll throw this in. This is free. For people in our current day and age, this is a growing population. For people that don't understand the role of father, that imagery is much harder to interpret and understand. So if people grow up without a father, or grow up with a father that doesn't know how to be a father, it colors the way they understand God. But that's not going to put pressure on how you live your life. I don't know what else I could say that would, because the way you affect the people around you colors their understanding of God. It colors the understanding of the church. It colors their understanding of what it means to be a Christian. Your friends in this world who are unbelievers don't know what a Christian is, but they know that you claim to be one. So they look at you and say, okay, that's what a Christian is. And so when someone else says, well, I'm a Christian, guess what they do? They take everything they know about you and apply it to that person. That's how this works. And so God knows that. And so he uses these images, this language, in signs and symbols, so that we grasp the concepts that he's trying to put to us. Consider the larger context of the whole Bible. This doesn't exist separate and apart from the rest of the Bible. It exists as part of a cohesive whole. It's part of the same tapestry. What you understand from the book of Revelation cannot contradict anything anywhere else in the Bible. And so if I read a passage and my conception about what that means is in direct conflict with a statement that I know what means in another place, guess what? My understanding of that passage is wrong. I need to go back and reevaluate and re-examine and re-ask the question. Consider the larger context. Never quotes the Old Testament directly, but scholars suggest that there are 400 allusions to the Old Testament in this one book. I don't know about that. Don't have the time to analyze it and find that out for myself. Those guys get paid to do that kind of work. They get paid to do those studies and to write those papers and to get published, and usually they get paid by some university for doing that kind of stuff. I'm just going to take them at their word and say it's entirely possible. They might be wrong, 10, 12, 100, one way or the other. I don't know. But what I do know is this. There's not a single bit of imagery that is completely unique to Revelation. The imagery used in this book is used all throughout the Bible. And it's important for us to understand that and realize that there's nothing to be afraid of. Talk to your brethren who are studying through this book. Get people that you trust in other places. Call them on the phone. Say, you know what? I've got a lot of respect for you. I've got a lot of respect for your knowledge of the Word of God. Would you read through Revelation? We're studying it right now. I would like to be able to talk to you about these things from time to time. I would like to be able to come to you with questions. So would you read and study along so that we can talk? Use the brethren in this class the same way. Think book club discussions. Listen, I've been for a long time contemplating letting that bounce around in the back of my head. My wife is part of a book club, and they get together, I think, once a month or once every 2 months or something. They pick a book, and they read it, and then they get together, and they have a dinner, and they talk about it. Talk about the things that they read in the book, and what they liked about it, and what they didn't like about it, and what they were impressed with, etc. And I thought, why don't we do that with books of the Bible? That's a perfectly good way to discuss these things as individuals. Be a great thing. So, look, do that. Think on those discussions. Look, I was reading through Revelation. We're studying on Sunday mornings. I was reading through it the other day, and I know you're in the class with me. What do you think about chapter 7 from this verse to this verse? I'm having a little trouble with that. But what else might I read? We got a college professor in the room. Actually, we got 2 college professors in the room. I'm pretty sure that a big part of their job is telling their students, reference this material and this material and this material, and reflect on what it says in connection with what you're trying to learn here. We can do that for one another. We can say, hey, I'll tell you what, I realized that Daniel chapter so-and-so uses some of the same kind of imagery as this, so go back and read that. And then read this again, and let's figure out if there's some connections in what we should learn from this. It's not really that hard. It just takes some time. But that's what all reading and studying does. And that's the difference, by the way, between reading and studying. So talk to your brethren. Listen to their thoughts and insights. Understand that not any one of us has the market cornered on knowledge. You can learn something from everyone. So listen. And listen to them from the perspective of going, hey, what are they right about that'll help me in developing my understanding of these things? For those that have walked in since we got started, this is the introduction to on the book of Revelation. And so, the live video there is back. Good. Sorry about the interruption for the guys that got online. Don't know why that happened. Yes, sir.
You may be going to head this way, but just a thought when you've been discussing is also keeping in mind. So John was writing this to primarily Jewish Christian,
Right.
Christians who had been Jews, I guess, who would have known all these Old Testament allusions and references. So when you said that he wrote this to be easy and understandable, especially if you know
if you have the familiarity.
Scriptures, right? If you have the familiarity, and of course, in kind of Roman Empire was maybe not the safest thing to be saying some of these things in like super straightforward language. So there's a little bit of that kind of duality there of like, if you know the context, it makes a lot of sense, and if you don't, it doesn't. It doesn't,
right? And there's some truth to that. By the way, that's true about all of our communication as well. Anybody know what the term jargon means? Okay, so it's technical language that arises within a particular field of study. And so you can generally, within a couple of minutes of talking to someone, know whether or not they've actually studied in a field that you're knowledgeable about, just by the words that they use to describe it and talk about it. You can tell the people who are trained musicians from the people who are not, from the way that they talk about music and the language that they use to talk about music, the things that they're familiar with. When you say something, they go, hey, he understood that. He studied some of this. He's not just making that up. The same is true in law. The same is true in medicine. I confuse doctors all the time because I'm pretty up on medical jargon for several reasons. I've been around hospitals and doctors way too much between family and church situations and helping other people. I've been in operating rooms when operations were going on. I've been in cath rooms when cath procedures were being done. I've had doctors actually with people open going, hey, come over here and look. Let me show you. A lot of it, this happens a lot actually when I'm in a hospital setting where I'm asked by doctors, well, what field are you in? They think I'm a doctor because I understand the jargon. I understand what they're talking about. I can't tell you the number of times I've had families ask me to come with them when the doctor's explaining something to basically function as an interpreter. to listen to the doctor and say, okay, basically he's saying this. Because some doctors aren't very good at breaking away from that jargon and speaking in common vernacular terms about it. So, what he's talking about is, if you're familiar with these other things in the Bible and with the language that's used in other places in the Bible, then you immediately recognize it. And if you're not familiar with it, you may not put those things together. And it may be more confusing for you. Same is true in terms of the immediate context. I can tell you, though, well, I'll even say it this way. And this kind of gets into the next phase of what I'm fixing to start talking about. And I'm jumping ahead. I think you'll be able to pull it into that discussion when I get there. But the way we interpret a particular section of this book is influenced by the circumstances that we are living under. And that gets into my hermeneutic of understanding this book a little bit. There's one of those jargon words. Anybody know what hermeneutic means? It's a way of interpretation. It's a method of interpretation. So part of my hermeneutic of understanding this book is that it has application. It has purpose. It means something, and it means something for us today. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But the particular circumstances that we exist under are different than the particular circumstances that first century Christians under Roman persecution lived under. Now, I would say that the point is exactly the same for both of us, but the circumstances and application of that point are slightly different. So it does affect the way that we view and understand these things, and that's okay. That's the way it ought to be. Just like music affects people differently. I can love a particular hymn, and it can bring a sense of joy to me, and someone else may immediately begin to weep when they hear the same song because they associate it with a loved one's funeral or a particular event at a particular place that may not be good. And so while I love this hymn, somebody else may go, oh, I don't like that one. Because it strikes them differently. They don't find it as a source of encouragement and hope. And so this is the same way, and it's part of it. And by the way, I believe that's why God has us talk about these things together. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. It's because of one person's sensibility to something, as long as it's not oversensitive. But one person's sensibility to something, you may pick up on something a lot quicker than someone else and be able to say, hey, but if you think about this and you think about it from this way, it means and has this application, and you go, you know what, they're right. And that gives me insight. And by the way, when you get insight opened up in that point, guess what happens later on in the book? You go, oh, wait a minute, this is connected to that. And so now I understand this too. And it just builds upon itself. And that's why he has us come together and encourage one another and instruct one another and do the things that we do when we're together. So talk to your brethren while we're studying through this and listen to their thoughts and insight, both inside the class and outside the class. Almost everyone. In fact, I think I could safely say this. Every one of us have a telephone. Some of us have multiple telephones. You can call one another Monday through Saturday and say, hey, you got time to talk for a minute? Well, yeah, I do. What you need? You know, I was reading through Revelation, and I got to this point. Have you reached that point? And if so, what do you think that's about? And that's part of the process of what we're doing here today. And that's what brings all of us into this room prepared for a discussion in which we all profit. My hope is not only that you have learned something by the time that we are through here, but that I have learned a lot. So that the next time that I teach this, I am better equipped to help guide those discussions and make them profitable for everyone. So keep those things in mind. Introduction. Let's look at some of the popular methods of interpreting this, the preterist view of interpreting this basically says that all of the symbols related only to the events of that day. Almost all these people say it was written before 70 AD, and it's only about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And in fact, that's generally a popular view among members of the church. Anybody want to offer a guess as to why that's a popular view among members of the church? It makes it very safe, and it answers all the questions that the millennialists raise from this book by just saying, it doesn't apply to us. That's over. That was done in 70 AD, and it's all behind us. I don't ascribe to this view. Now, having said that, I do believe that it dealt with those circumstances, and it dealt with that situation, and it prepared and enabled Christians who lived through that to do so. When you get to the dating of this book, almost everybody now, in terms of scholarship, accepts a late date writing. I'm going to go on record and let you know I don't think it was the last book written. I actually think Jude was probably the last book written. Jude has the tone and tenor of a Malachi, of a this is the last ditch. I wanted to write about it, but I have to tell you about these things. This is important. This is the last chance for this to be said. It has that tone to it. Sounds a lot in tone the way Malachi sounds at the end of the Old Testament, which, by the way, was God's last prophet before the famine of 400 years when he said nothing. So I don't think this was the very last book to be inspired, but I think it was probably one of the last books to be inspired. One of the very late books. It probably is a late date. Do we know exactly what date it was written? No. So I'm going to tell you the same thing that I always say, and if you've been in very many of my classes, you have heard this so many times that you're probably tired of hearing it. If it matters the setting, when the time frame is, it is in the text. It will say, the 3rd year of the reign of so-and-so, and you will know exactly when it's talking about. If it's not in the text, it probably isn't essential to understanding the text. I say that for 2 reasons. One, because it just makes sense. A good communicator communicates everything that you need to know to understand them. I think God's a good communicator. Secondly, I think it's essentially what God told us through Peter when he wrote that he has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him. Everything that he has revealed is self-contained and able to give us all the information that we need in order to understand the things that we need to understand. And so I am convinced if it mattered, it would be in the text and we could read it and know for certain. So the big debate about when it comes, listen, that debate about dating only becomes important if you hold the preterist view. You have to make this thing before AD 70 if it's about the events of the destruction of Jerusalem. If it's written after those events, then you've got a problem. If your whole position is that it only dealt with those things. So that's why it becomes a big deal for people as to when it was written. I don't think it matters all that much. The historical view holds that Revelation outlines in symbolic form the entire course of history from Pentecost to the return of Christ. This is just a big picture of this age. I don't really buy all that. They take all these various things as being the breakup of the Roman Empire and this going on, and there's a scene of locusts that come out. Okay, that's the Muslims. That's what they say. And so they have an explanation for everything. It's a historical timeline, which, by the way, if it was and we could figure it out and follow it, which the only reason to communicate is so that you can understand what's being said. So if it was, and then we would also be able to know when the end is. we'd be able to learn this timeline, study it real good, and go, hey, wait a minute. All right, this is it. It's time. It's over. But guess what? We've already been told in other places that that's not the way it is, that nobody knows when future events are going to happen except who? God. Only God knows those things. Only God knows the end from the beginning. He hasn't informed us of that. And we have to be prepared. There's so much teaching in the New Testament about being prepared for his coming, because he's going to come as a thief and at a time in which you do not expect him. So I would tell you that the historical view is just incompatible with the rest of the Scripture. The futurist view basically says what it sounds like it says. It's all in the future. It's end-time stuff. It's about the coming millennia. These are all premillennial people. We are premillennial. When the millennia arrives and Jesus returns to the earth and sits on his throne in Jerusalem, a physical throne in Jerusalem, that's what they believe, that this is describing the events of all of that. This is a popular view in the general world. This is the view that the Dan Brown novels take and Left Behind stuff takes and all that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm not convinced that this is the way to read it either, for a lot of reasons. The biggest one being is I don't believe that Jesus is going to physically reign on the earth in Jerusalem. When the Bible talks about his second coming, it says he's coming with angels, he's coming to usher in the resurrection, to take the righteous to be with him, and that unrighteous are going to be cast eternally into fire. What's going to happen to the earth and all of its works? They're going to be burned up and destroyed. Peter makes that pretty clear. That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for doubt. They sandwich it in there. They just say, well, this is 1,000 years between the actual destruction and when it starts. But I don't find any support for that personally. So just keep that in mind. So the spiritualist or the spiritual or idealist view says it doesn't have any reference to any specific events. By the way, this one comes closer to my understanding probably than any of them, although this is not my exact understanding. This comes closer probably than the rest of them. It's the presentation of great principles intended to guide and encourage followers of Christ through all the ages. And I'm generally falling into this basic category. And so, again, not precisely, but generally speaking. Oops, I jumped ahead. Oh, I know what happened. I need to do this. There we go. I'm convinced, for instance, in terms of the futurist idea, that if the text didn't hold value to the people who received it in the first century, why would he have had it written then? Why would he have moved the prophet to write it at the time? It had to have immediate application. Not to mention, it actually says in the text that these things must shortly come to pass, which again means nothing if it doesn't suggest that it had application to the immediate recipients of it. If it's only about the millennial view, the end time stuff, then it doesn't mean anything to any of us who don't live through that. That fights against my understanding of all of the Scripture, by the way, not just Revelation, the entire book. And this is a problem I think that even many modern New Testament Christians make, in that they think, well, we're not under the law of Moses, and so we don't need to study that stuff. Yes, we do. Every bit of it is preserved and kept for our learning and instruction so that we have the understanding and the grasp of who God is and what righteousness is and what God has done, so that we understand all of these things. You cannot understand the New Testament gospel without understanding the Old Testament revelation. It's just not possible. And so it all has a place and a purpose. It's preserved by God for us. It would not have been, if it only applied to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army, why preserve it for us? That we know there were other letters written that weren't preserved. So why preserve this and keep it for us if it's all in the past and it doesn't have any effect on us? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It doesn't pass just the reasoning test, which, by the way, I'm convinced that we're supposed to do with the Bible. Come, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. When he said that through Isaiah the prophet, recorded in Isaiah 1:18, did that have immediate application? Sure it did. But was it possible at that moment for them to have their sins remitted? No. That wasn't going to happen until what? Till Christ came. So, they had value in it. We have value in it. We come to understand it all by reading it all and by understanding it all. So just keep that in mind. I think the text has value for us, or it wouldn't have been preserved for our studying and for our teaching. Last time I checked, the Bible still says that we have an obligation to do what? Teach the whole counsel of God. This is part of that. So if we have an obligation to study and teach it, then God expects us to learn something from it, and expects us to use what we learn to control the way that we view ourselves and we view Him and we view our existence in time in the way we should behave while we're here. What we should value and hold as important. What we should be afraid of, what we should not be afraid of. Whether or not we can persevere. All that, are we going to lose the battle? There was a study that just came out. It was among evangelical pastors. Okay, so this is a subset of people we're talking about. These people, as a rule, I got to say that now because this is the way we conceive them, are people who believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, and they are preachers. And they were studied and they were asked whether they had a biblical worldview, and I think it was something like 37% said yes. And they were asked about truth and whether it could be known and whether it was absolute. And most of them said, no. Your truth is yours and my truth is mine. That's frightening. And so you read stuff like that, you find out that only 30% of the people who are teaching people the Bible actually believe the worldview that the Bible is teaching. What do you think for those people who are listening to them? Those that are learning from them are not learning a biblical worldview. And the suggestion has been made over and over again that Christianity, this is post-Christian. We are in a post-Christian era. We are past that now. The number of believers in general in our country has continued to drop. The bell ringer has not arrived, and it is time to stop. And so Christianity's dead. No, it's not. And that's a big part of the message of Revelation. That's 1 and 2 all together, right? See, I didn't have to stop till right now because the bells just rang. So think about this. Hopefully between now and next Sunday, at least read the book once. Find the time to read it once. And if you can read it more than that, that's